This garden may look overgrown to some, but what it's full of is biomass that could be easily collected and used as mulch in a grass-fed garden or a natural farming technique. Hey, I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead, and what we've got in front of us is a lot of grass that actually has gone to seed, so it's not ideal unless we need that seed out in areas here. And you can see some overgrown areas that had little cultivation, but for the majority of this space, we're able to produce a large volume of biomass from the grasses and the materials that are growing between the vegetables. So you see sedge grass, a lot of wildflowers. You'll see hairy vetch around trees here. Then you'll see some corn. It's a little bit overgrown, but there's other patches of corn. Then you'll see more garden beds that are overgrown. But essentially what we're able to produce here is a lot of mulch to feed that soil. For this particular site, the soil is clay, a lot of clay, and we need as much biomass as possible to keep putting into the ground. So what you'll see is there's layers and layers of grass that has been cut and put into the beds, and we're also removing a lot of the rocks that we find. Now there's still some nightshades and an overwhelming hairy vetch, but what's interesting about the hairy vetch is that underneath it is pretty much just hairy vetch. So it chokes out the other weeds. But you will find an abundance of tomatoes. Some of these other areas are a little too overgrown because we don't have as many people here as we need to cut it regularly. But you'll find tomatoes and fruit trees and sunflowers coming up and wildflowers and little trails here and there that have mulch laid down in them. And there's green peppers and an abundance of everything else. Now, what's going on here? So first off, there is a little bit of natural farming going on where we let the environment just grow out. We have a little bit of English natural gardens by having clear aisleways between the beds. We also have wildflowers. And then we have a little bit of broad acreage down here. If you remember the old videos, I tilled this, lightly tilled this, maybe an inch in the ground, and you can see all that has grown up. But what has grown up is a combination of the corn, but also everything else. So there's a massive seed bank here. But we don't mind. We'll pick the corn. We'll push through here. The corn looks really good. We'll push through here. And then at the end of the season, I'll come through and flail mow. So we actually do see a little bit of corn sticking out here. Give you a look at that. That one's not as mature, but I'll take it off anyway because it's got knocked down a little bit. Now, you might argue that the other plants are competing with the corn, but hairy vetch is a nitrogen fixer. Some of these other plants are just biomass weeds. Ideally, what we would do is go through the rows with a scythe or a sickle, and we would just slowly cut all this grass and just lay on the ground to be a weed barrier. But again, if you don't have the manpower, this is fine. Next year in the design, I am going to add a wide row between each of the broadacre areas. So each of the areas we're putting corn, I'll leave a wide row so I can push the flail mower down it, and then let the flail mower cut a path. That way people will be more comfortable coming in and harvest. Here's some wheat that needed to be harvested, and we're still going to harvest that, but it's going to be harvested by hand, flail mowed when it's done to just get it real low to the ground. I can flail mow a ½ an inch tall. So after we cycle through here and get the grain out, we'll have seeds for next year, but then I can come through and then cut everything down into a fine pulp, and then that'll fertilize this ground. It may or may not need to be tilled. Again, we're doing very shallow tillage. We're doing very more of just chopping this down with the flail mower and then kind of just lightly turning it over on the soil. Because again, we're only tilling about an inch or two. So we're staying in the topsoil area. Now that's just to incorporate all this material. Now what we got to do, here's some tips to take away, is we got to remember to cut this stuff before it goes to seed. So I see a melon here. I need to go back in there somewhere and find the melons. And you can actually see the melons climbing out over the top. If the melons are shaded, they're not going to grow. And some of this stuff is not as prime edible as we like it. So again, access is important. I probably should have a trail to flail mow in. And then areas that have weedy areas, I need to keep that in mind because those areas need to have the pH levels worked on and flailed. But what we've got in here is nitrogen fixing. Actually, this may be alfalfa. That may be alfalfa. So that's nitrogen fixing. Those types of things can be done with a hand sickle, and you're just, as you're going up the row to harvest corn, you're just chopping the grass down to make your path a little clearer and to also feed the soil. Again, all of this biomass is about feeding the soil. We're at about 60% clay, 50% clay, and we really don't have good topsoil yet. We have enough to start things, but it's, again, if you go down a foot, it's clay. So what we keep doing is incorporating biomass. We can haul in the biomass, we could bring in chips, we could bring in straw, but we can also grow the biomass locally. So here is a bed of cut flowers. They're not as spectacular as they were earlier because it's about July, but we had a lot of that going on. But again, this area can be flail mowed, and then it's going to need to be mulched out. You can kind of see that there are rows of what is cut flowers. Those rows probably need to be mulched so they're easier to find. Over here in the little food forest area, you can see everything's growing up pretty good, but I'll have to get in here by hand and chop and drop around things like these Jerusalem artichokes. And then there are more plants that have revealed themselves, more of these persimmons right here and down there. So we're going to expand the area. I'm not sure if the strawberries are still going in here, but I might want to go around where the strawberries were and chop and drop to make sure those don't get smothered out. You can kind of see what's going on here. Now, what's exciting about this site, again, I'm at Sustainable Homestead Institute, is that honeybees have gone in. There's about to be a hive to split. The fruit trees are going strong. And all of this area has different demonstrations, different types of plants. Now, I am selectively going around. See, these are cleaning out the greenhouse. You know, this doesn't have to be in a pile. This could be just thrown out on beds. But again, they put it in a pile and turn it a couple times to kill the seeds before it goes out on beds. And then tall stuff like this needs to be chopped before it gets high. So that's something I'm going to work on before I leave. But you can see it's overgrown. It is definitely and obviously overgrown. But again, it's a demonstration site, and we're demonstrating different methods. And because it's kind of a low intensity, we're not going in and cutting everything every day. Let me show you something here. It's real interesting. In a past video, we talked about how we're cutting the sides of these honey locust, and then we're going to pollard the tops of them. Over here is an example of what happens when the top gets heavier than the bottom. It starts to pull the tree out of the ground. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to keep digging around this tree. Eventually, it's just going to fall out of the ground and die. But as I cut the tops out of it, it will get weak. So what we're ending up with is we start with a tree like this, and then it gets like that over there, and then it gets taller than your head, and you start pollarding it, and it'll have like a pom-pom on the top of it, and the bottom will get nice and thick. And eventually the tree gets old, and it just dies, and no other trees pop up, because there used to be a lot of little suckers in here when we just cut it off at the ground. Then, of course, we have a persimmon. So our honey locusts are nitrogen fixing. They're feeding the soil. We're mulching around those trees as well. Might even pour compost in here. You don't quite want to feed your honey locusts, but there is a tree in here that we could probably put straw around, do some chop and drop, and then when that persimmon gets bigger, we start working on that fruit tree. So I'm going to, again, cut all these weeds down and just lay them on the ground. But when I cut them to chop and drop, they're going to go around the valuable trees. They're going to go on the beds. I'm going to be mindful of seed. And we're just going to keep incorporating the materials to keep building up the soil. And of course, we got all kinds of little volunteers everywhere. So here we go, another bit of hairy vetch. Nothing was growing here, so hairy vetch is fine to grow here. But you'll see right above it, look at those bees, how excited they are on those sunflowers. Isn't that beautiful? So we could do some chop and drop in here. We would take the chop and drop and rake it up and put it on the beds because the structural elements don't really need that much mulch. We want vegetation to grow on the structure. But the mulch goes in the beds to feed the soil. All of this biomass feeds the soil. But just look at that. Isn't that beautiful? Look at those bees having a good time. Now, if it was cooler, I would come in here and take out some of the plants that are they're not sunflowers. But the bees don't care. So, takeaway. Let me finish up on this. All of this biomass that's on the ground, chop it, drop it, put it all around the plants you want to keep. Put it on the beds where you want nutrients. Try to get it chopped and dropped before you have seed heads on things. But if you don't get to it, don't worry about it too much. Just make sure you have clear paths so you can harvest. Because we're covering the soil, because we're feeding the soil with the chop and drop and the nitrogen fixing cover crops, you will have an abundance of plants. But you don't want them to go to waste. So you've got to drudge through here a little bit. You'll notice a lot of the small birds are having a great time. Those birds are eating insects and things. But you do have to cut yourself a path in here with a hand sickle or a scythe and keep layering, keep mounding, keep bringing in materials, and you will end up with such a soil abundance. Soil that is biologically active, that is feeding the plants, and you won't need to add any fertilizer. We don't add any fertilizer in this. It's just chop and drop, and nitrogen fixing plants. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. You can ask your questions at www.prosperityhomestead.org, or you can leave them in the comments below. I do my best to answer every question. I'll see you in the next video.